So the first group of debates that I have is choice versus imposition. I think this is one of the most prominent debates. And it's basically just, is it a net positive for people to engage in choice X? And it's often heavily linked with two other types of debates I'll be discussing in other videos I should have uploaded by now. Ban versus regulation debates and individual versus community debates. And this can manifest in regretting or supporting these decisions or just overall banning people from being able to make that choice or decision to begin with. Some basic sample motions. This house would ban smoking. Should people be allowed to do this? Second, this house would allow workers to give up their benefits in exchange for higher compensation. Or assuming feasibility, this is a bit more of a hypothetical world motion. This house would allow people to sell years of their lifespan. So just asking, should you allow people to make this choice? Or should you bar them from engaging in it at all? I think less intuitive sample motions of this are democracy motions and free speech motions. So for example, if you have this house would require all declarations of war to pass a national referendum, or this house would elect central bank authorities. At its core, it's just, should we allow people to choose this? And a lot of the same frameworks of thought for the other motions will probably apply in these kinds of motions as well. I think for free speech motions, it's a bit more unintuitive. But I think in essence, what you're doing is you're leaving the ability to engage, to speak, to decide what is good, what is bad, what speech is good, what is bad, up to people, rather than having some kind of body decide it for them. So, for example, in this house believes that there should be no censorship in art. What you're basically saying is you should allow people to spread what kind of art that they want, create the kind of art that they want, rather than have some kind of other body say, you can't make this kind of art, you can't like or engage in this kind of art for XYZ reasons. So first, you have to assess, is there a right to choice to begin with? Beyond being able to assess that choice, it's just a matter of, should this person be able to make that choice? And that right can be determined by proximity. So for example, maybe you are very close to where this decision matters, where it applies. So for example, there are motions about whether or not you would allow migrants to vote. And you might say that because they are in the area where it's most likely to occur, they should have a choice. They're very proximate to the area of effect. Next is stake. So do you have something that you own and therefore you should be able to make a choice on it? Are you personally invested in something and therefore you should be able to make a choice on it? So for example, if you have a property, you should probably be able to decide what happens with that property. Or other kinds of stake. One of the counter arguments for allowing migrants to vote is that they don't have enough stake, meaning if things get bad, they can just leave, whereas citizens would probably have to stay, and therefore they would have to ensure that you vote well, that you don't vote for just short-term policies, etc. So there's a stake, a long-term stake at that. Third is capacity. We'll go into that a bit more in depth, but are you able to make that decision? Fourth is a legal obligation or relationship, and that's particularly important when you are not allowing someone or someone can't make the decision for themselves. So for example, if you have a child, you obviously can't expect like a 2-year-old to make a decision about their life, and therefore you will give that kind of responsibility to their parent. The same could be true for medical situations where someone might be incapacitated, etc. Next is a lack of objectivity. And what I mean by this is there are some instances where what is good, what is acceptable, is not clear, it's not clear cut. And therefore you'll often leave the choice up to people to decide what that might be. So going back to free speech debates, who decides what good or unallowable speech is? And some proponents of free speech will instead say society should be able to decide that. That goes on to like markets, for example, or even ideas, etc. Last is just the effect on others. So maybe you have some stake in it, maybe you have some kind of effect, but is it affect you, or does your choice affect you more than it might affect other people? And to the extent that it affects other people, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to make that choice if you are not the primary person affected by it. And you have to discuss this, especially when, again, people are allowed to decide rights, or rather have the right to decide on your behalf, such as parents and children, spouses, etc. Or debates about granting people more of a right to decide. So for example, giving migrants votes or changing the number of votes that someone might have. I've seen motions about giving people who are more empathetic more votes. motions about giving younger people more votes. And the way you go about it is to say, for younger people, for example, that they will go through the long-term changes that a country will go through. Well, old people will probably die off before that happens. They should get more of a vote. The willingness to consent. So consent isn't just like a yes or say, I want this. It's a question of, are you able to make that decision freely? And oftentimes there's an external pressure that might exist, and you have to assess what other figures are pressuring an individual or a person to act. And that's a very important line to be able to draw, because I think in all decisions that you make, it's not really just you. To some extent, you are pressured, maybe more so informed by family, by friends, by culture, by media, etc. And therefore, the presence of an external pressure is not enough. I think you have to ask, number one, to what extent do they have control over the individual's choices? Should have finished that bullet. So, say it's your boss. It's very hard to say no to your boss if you are reliant on them for your job or for your work, for example. And therefore, that is a very active form of pressure that would exist against you. Second is, are you just internalizing beliefs, or are you actively being pushed towards a decision that you do not want to do? So let's say you want to do something, but your parents will not allow you to do it. Um, that is an example of where pressure is being enacted. Versus if you're in a family where your parents might have heavily informed your worldview, your politics, but you personally want to do it, I would not necessarily say that that's external pressure anymore. So for example, this house would ban children from participating in religious rites and activities. You could say that children can't say no to their parents, and therefore they have very little choice as to what kind of religion they'd want to opt into, and therefore they don't have consent over the religion they are a part of. Moreover, they can't leave that religion because they will be seen as a sinner, they might be shunned by their community, etc. There's also a temporal aspect to consent, right? Like just because you consent to something at 15 years old, or like let's say even older where you're at the full age of majority, just because you consent to something at like 25 years old, doesn't mean that you should have to live with that decision until you're 60 years old, which is why contracts expire, you need to make sure there are opt-out clauses for everything, etc. And so you want to assess, what is the permanence of this decision? Both in terms of, can I opt out of that decision in the future? But also, are there things that I will go through now that will permanently alter my future? Will it have irreversible impacts on my future? There's also the question of your ability to consent, and I think informed consent is one of the most important aspects here. So, can you make a choice with all the knowledge that is required to make that choice, right? Because choices are often rational decisions you would have to go through. It's a question of, do you have enough information to be able to make that choice? So number one is just, is information regarding this decision available? If not, then I'm not sure if that's the most informed choice. An example of this might be debates about experimental treatments. You might not know what could happen to you, and it's hard to assess whether or not you can opt into or fully make the choice of an experimental treatment. Second, can it be easily processed by the decision maker? Meaning, even if the information is available, do the people making decisions understand it? So going back to motions about this house would elect central bank authorities. On op, you could say, look, you could give people like economic data, financial data. It doesn't necessarily mean they understand what it would mean, or like whether what kinds of decisions as to who to elect for whichever like authority you might have for the central bank. Third is the information changing? Could they meaningfully act on this information? And I think this is particularly important with respect to maybe an ongoing situation, like an active crime, an active, like, let's say there's a criminal on the loose. Can you make a decision regarding that? Or for maybe something like COVID-19, where in the first few months of COVID, we really had no idea what this virus was. Was it airborne? Were masks necessary? And they ended up like being, like yes, masks did help. Vaccines, would they come at a certain date? When could we expect them? All these questions were up in the air. Lastly, is this information accurate? Because if you're making a decision based on inaccurate information, then I don't think that's a very fair decision to make to begin with. In addition to this, is there an entity that is deceiving or manipulating you to make a decision? So that's why there are big questions about fake news and democracy. Because is it really a fair democracy if people are voting on the basis of lies, of disinformation, etc.? Next is also just the state of decision making. So maybe you have the information, you know how to process this information, but at the time at which you're making the decision, are you in the correct state? So are you incapacitated in any way? Are you drunk? Are you under like the influence of substances? Are you in a heightened state of emotion? That's why, for example, crimes of passion are much less likely to get big punishment than premeditated crimes, because you recognize that people in an intense state of emotion might do things they might not have done otherwise. Also, time. If you don't have enough time, the panic can set in, you might not be able to take in all the facts, and therefore it might be hard to consent in these kinds of instances. It's also just the presence of alternatives. So is it really a choice if there's not much else you could choose to do? So for example, this house would allow the sale of organs. I think when you have a debate where you have very few alternatives for some people, it's a question of, could you expand the alternatives possibly? And if not, is this the best choice? Because when you might not have alternatives, giving someone the choice to do something could possibly be the best thing to, I don't know, make sure that other choices get better as well. So if you're defending the ability to make the choice, you have to explain why other alternatives are unlikely or are too difficult. So in this motion, for example, I'd say that if someone is willing to sell their organs, they're probably in a really bad situation. They have a lot of problems they need to be able to solve. They're probably incredibly desperate. This is obviously unfortunate, but it's better than what else they might be forced to do. But if you are opposing the choice, you have to explain how alternatives can come up and why they're better. And I think an important thing to note about these kinds of choices is that people don't want to engage in the act itself. Meaning nobody wants to sell their organs, but they would be willing to sell their organs for money. And therefore you have to assess, is that another form of pressure? Is the economic situation, the financial situation, a pressure that is too big such that people cannot actively make a good decision in this instance? Um, I guess basically a cost benefit analysis is needed. You just have to explain why the costs of a choice could outweigh the benefits or vice versa. So it would be helpful as well to explain what types of people would be making these choices. So for example, in the motion, this house regrets the significant recruitment of low-income individuals into the military. Well, the military might not be the best job or institution you could be a part of. You'd have to say, well, the people that are opting into this oftentimes have difficulty accessing a college education, they might not have the best job prospects, etc. Whereas the military might be willing to pay for your college, they might give you significant benefits, etc. And that's why the benefit could outweigh the cost. Note as well that you should be doing extensive cost-benefit analysis. Not only rather should you be doing that, but also you should explain why people are able to do this. Rather, like the people in the debate can do cost-benefit analysis. Because if they can do it, that proves they are making a rational decision. If they can't do it, then they might not be making a rational decision. And there's a lot of lead into other debates here. So ban versus regulation debates are heavily determined by this. There are debates about individuals and the community and whether or not choices that prefer the individual to the community would be beneficial. So that's all for this one.